So in this video, I'm going to talk about the types of transport across the cell membrane by answering these two questions. Okay, so this question saying state the four types of passive transport mechanism in your mind. Okay, then the other one is saying state the four types of active transport mechanism in humans. Okay, so these are the two questions I'm going to answer. Okay, so as you know, there are two types of transports across the membrane. Okay, so which are passive transport and active transport. Okay, so let's start discussing passive transport by answering this question. Okay, which is saying state the four types of passive transport across the cell membrane. Okay, so there are four types of transport in terms of when you're talking about passive. Okay, so there are four types of passive transport across the cell membrane. Okay, so let me just state them. Number one, you have what we call simple diffusion. Okay, so simple diffusion, that's number one. Number two, we have what we call facilitated diffusion. Okay, that's number two, facilitated diffusion. Okay, so that's number two. Okay, then the third one, we have what we call osmosis. Okay, this is the third one. We have what we call osmosis. Okay, osmosis. Okay, then another type, the fourth one. Okay, the fourth one is what we call filtration. Okay, so it's what we call filtration. Okay, so these are the types of uh, passive transport across the cell membrane. Okay, so let me start uh, 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 discussing one by one, all of them, all these four types one by one. Okay, so I'll start with simple diffusion. Okay, so in terms of simple diffusion, we are talking about transport across the membrane. Okay, so this, what you have to know about all those four types of this state, they do not require energy. Okay, so passive transport do not require energy for it to happen. Okay, then the other thing you have to know, these guys, particles are going to be moving down the concentration gradient. Okay, so particles are going to be moving down the concentration gradient. Okay, so okay, so when we are talking about simple diffusion, okay, so we are talking about molecules. Okay, so we have these molecules which are lipid soluble. Okay, so these molecules which are lipid soluble, we are talking about molecules that are not charged. Most of the molecules which are not charged, they are lipid soluble. Okay, so we're talking about small molecules like your oxygen. Okay, so your oxygen, your carbon dioxide, those small molecules are non-polar and they are able to diffuse across the lipid bilayer. Okay, so that's what we are having there. Okay, so you have small molecules like oxygen, your carbon dioxide, which are non-polar or which are lipid soluble. Okay, so they are able to to move across the cell membrane. Okay, so these molecules will be moving from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration. Of course, no energy is required in this type of transport. Okay, so that's about simple diffusion. Okay, so when you talk about the other type of passive transport, which is facilitated diffusion. Okay, so facilitated diffusion. So here on the first one, on simple diffusion, you've noticed that we're talking about those molecules which are non-polar. Okay, which are lipid soluble. What about those small molecules which are not lipid sodium? Okay, how do they move? Okay, we are talking about polar molecules. Okay, like your ions. Okay, you're talking about polar molecules like your ions. Okay, your calcium. Okay, these are polar molecules, your calcium, your chloride. Okay, your sodium, these are polar molecules. Okay, even glucose is a polar molecule. Okay, so your sodium there. Okay, so these are polar molecules. Okay, So they can't diffuse just on the cell membrane. Okay, so they will require a certain protein. Okay, so they will require a certain protein. Say that it can be a protein channel. Okay, it can be a protein channel or a protein carrier. Any of those two. Okay, so a protein channel. So they will move across the cell membrane through a protein channel or a what? A protein carrier. Okay, so that's what you have in there. Okay, so that's about facilitated diffusion. So small particles will be moving, and we are talking about polar particles, which are also lipid soluble particles. Okay, so they will be moving across the cell membrane via a particular protein channel or carrier. Okay, so that's about it. Facilitated. Okay, what of osmosis? Okay, so the third one was osmosis. What is it? Okay, what happened? Okay, so osmosis is another type of passive transport. Okay, so it, of course, no energy is required as usual. Okay, so now here you know that particles, okay, particles will be diffusing, okay, from a region of what? A region of high concentration or of low concentration to a region of high concentration. Okay, so here we are talking about water molecules. Okay, so you have those water molecules which are going to be moving from a region of low concentration to a region of high concentration via what we call aquapolines. Okay, so there are a proteins channel called aquapolines. So water will be diffusing across the membrane using those ion channels. Okay, aquapolines. Okay, so that's what happens in osmosis. Okay, then the fourth type is what we call filtration. Okay, so the fourth type is filtration. Okay, so here particles will be moving. Okay, so we are talking about particles or molecules like water and solute. Okay, so these ones they will be moving under what we call hydrostatic pressure. Okay, so they will be moving under what we call hydrostatic pressure. Okay, so molecules will be moving from high pressure to low pressure. Of course, no energy will be are required as usual. Okay, so those are the four types of transport mechanism, of passive transport mechanism across the cell membrane. Okay, so let me answer the second one, which is uh, uh, active transport. Okay, so the other type of transport across the membrane is what we call active transport. Okay, so what do we have under active transport? Okay, generally we have three main types of transport here. Okay, so we can have what we call um, primary active transport. Okay, so we have what we call primary active transport. Okay, primary active, so primary active transport. Okay, that's the first one. Okay, we can have what we call the second one. We can have what we call secondary active transport. Okay, so we can have what we call secondary active transport. Okay, secondary active transport. That's the second one. Okay, then the third one. Okay, the third one is what we call vascular transport. Okay, or in other ways, we can call it bulk filtration. Okay, so we can call it, let me say, bulk filtration. Bulk filtration. Okay, so under vascular transport, you have two types. Okay, so you have what we call endocytosis. Okay, so you have what we call endocytosis and the exocytosis. That's what we have under vascular transport. Okay, so we have what we call exocytosis and the endocytosis. Okay, so let me now discuss them one by one. Okay, let me start with primary active transport. Okay, so what you have to know under active, for passive we said no energies are required. Okay, for this one, for active you need energy in form of ATP, okay, to move your molecules across the cell membrane, okay. So you need energy in form of ATP. And remember, we said in passive, we said particles were moving down the concentration gradient, okay. Then here, particles will be moving against the concentration gradient, okay. That's what you are having here, okay. So let me start with primary. As usual, it will need ATP. Now, under primary, you have your ATP directly, okay, moving substances across the cell membrane, okay. So you are getting your energy direct from ATP. Then that ATP is used to move substances across the what? The membrane, okay. So example of such type of transport is what a good example is the sodium potassium ATPase, okay. So that one which will be moving 3 sodium out of the cell, and then it will be taking 2 potassium inside the cell, okay. Then you need ATP for that to happen. That's a good example of a primary active transport, your sodium potassium ATPase, okay, PAM, okay. So let me just write it there, okay. So your sodium, so a good example here is your sodium, okay. So your sodium, potassium, there's a plus there, okay. Sodium, potassium, ATPase, okay. ATPase pump. That's a good example of your active, your primary active transport, okay, where you need ATP, okay. So you need ATP to move substances across the membrane, okay. So here, this one, what it will be doing, it will be taking 3 sodium outside the cell, then it will be getting 2 potassium inside the cell, okay. So that's under primary active transport, okay. Then for secondary active transport, okay, so this one, you do not get your energy direct from ATP, okay. So what will happen is that this energy you've made here, okay, it's the one you're going to use to move substances across the cell membrane in the secondary active transport, okay. So this energy which is used in a secondary is the one, so the one you've synthesized in primary, okay. So it's the one which you are going to use to do your secondary active transport, okay. So here, good examples, you can have what we call simple tasks, okay. So simple tasks, for simple tasks, substances will be moving in the same direction, okay. That's a good example of secondary active transport, okay. So your simple tasks, so you have substances moving in the same direction, okay. So a good example of a simple tar is your GRUT, okay? Your GRUT molecule, where when you start doing your glycolysis, okay, you notice that you need this GRUT to move glucose molecule inside the cell, okay? So that's a good example of a simple tar, okay, or a simple type of transport, okay? So this one, molecules will be moving in the same direction, okay? Then you can have what we call an antipode, okay? An antipode, okay? So here are substances, okay, will be moving in different directions, okay? So a good example of an antipode is what we call the sodium hydrogen exchanger, okay? So sodium hydrogen exchanger, that's a good example of an antipode, okay, where um substances will be moving in what, in different direction, okay. So where you are taking in your sodium, then your hydrogen is coming out, or the other way around. That's what you are having there, okay. So that's what a secondary active transport is, okay. Let me go to what we call a backfill or vesicular transport. Okay, so under vesicular transport, like I said, we have what we call endocytosis. Okay, endocytosis. Endo means you are taking things inside the cell. Okay, so you get things outside the cell. Okay, you fuse them with the with the cell. Okay, in the vesicle. Okay, then you release them inside the cell. Okay, that's what we call endocytosis. Endo means inside. Okay, so you're taking things inside the cell from the outside the cell. Okay, so examples, good examples of endocytosis, you can have your uh, phagocytosis there. Okay, so phagocytosis, you can have what we call pinocytosis, also popular known as cell drinking. Okay, so you are taking in fluid. Okay, so that's a good example for an endocytosis. Okay, then we can also have what we call exocytosis. Okay, so that's a second type of vascular transport. Okay, exocytosis. Okay, so under exocytosis is the opposite of endocytosis. Okay, so you are getting things out inside your cell. Okay, you fuse them with the membrane. Okay, in the vesicle, then you release them outside the cell. That's what we call exocytosis. Okay, so we'll understand more. Okay, or we'll look at it when we start doing the neuromuscular junction there. Okay, so you will see how this for example, there are vesicles in the presynaptic membrane. Okay, so those vesicles are storing a what a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. Okay, so you find that these vesicles usually fuse with the membrane of your presynaptic. Okay, then when it fuses, then it releases things in the presynaptic cleft like that. That's a good example of exocytosis, where things are released from inside the cell to the outside the cell. Okay, so that's a good example of endocytosis. Okay, so these are the types of active transport, or these are the types of active, and I've also talked about the other one, the passive type of transport across the membrane.